Sirens shattered the quiet exclusivity of the Connecticut estate on a crisp Tuesday morning. Nobody expected federal agents to drag a beloved tech mogul out in handcuffs, but while cameras flashed and terrified children screamed, one woman standing in the shadows held a secret that would burn everything to the ground. Morning light usually poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore mansion, like liquid gold warming the Italian marble floors. Raymond Whitmore, a 42-year-old billionaire who had revolutionized global supply chain logistics with a proprietary AI network, sat at the massive oak dining table. He was nursing a black coffee, his eyes glued to a tablet displaying plummeting stock graphs. The financial press had been hounding his company Apex Meridian for weeks over missing funds. But Raymond had assured everyone it was a simple accounting error. Standing a few feet away, wiping down the flawless quartz countertops, was Barbara Brown, a 50-year-old black woman with sharp, observant eyes and a demeanor carved from decades of surviving a world that rarely handed out favors. Barbara was officially the estate's head housekeeper. In reality, she was the gravitational force holding the Whitmore family together. Ever since Raymond's wife died in a tragic aviation accident 3 years prior, Barbara had stepped in to raise his 6-year-old twins, Leo and Harper. She knew their allergies, their night terrors, and the precise way to cut their sandwiches so they wouldn't complain. More importantly, she knew Raymond. She knew his stress mechanisms and the fact that he hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night for the past month. Pancakes sizzled on the griddle. Leo and Harper were chasing each other around the kitchen island, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings, blissfully unaware of the corporate storm brewing around their father. Barbara smiled softly, sliding a perfectly golden pancake onto a porcelain plate. "Leo, stop pulling your sister's hair before I make you eat the crusts," she warned, her tone warm but authoritative. Then came the noise. It wasn't a knock. It was a rhythmic, violent thud that reverberated through the heavy oak double doors at the front of the house. Before Raymond could even stand up, the front doors burst open with an explosive crack, the frame splintering inward. Dozens of men and women in heavy tactical gear swarmed into the grand foyer. Windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC cut through the refined elegance of the house like a violent stain. Orders were shouted in rapid-fire succession. Laser sights danced across the walls over expensive oil paintings and finally settled on Raymond's chest. "Raymond Whitmore, keep your hands where we can see them. Do not move!" A lead agent roared, his weapon raised. Panic erupted. Harper let out an ear-piercing scream, dropping her favorite stuffed rabbit onto the floor. Leo froze, his small body trembling as he stared at the men with guns surrounding his father. Barbara moved on pure instinct. Abandoning the spatula, she sprinted across the kitchen, scooping Harper into one arm and dragging Leo behind her by the hand. She pulled them into the corner of the breakfast nook, shielding their small bodies with her own. "Don't look, babies. Close your eyes. I've got you bees, got you," she chanted, pressing their faces into her apron. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of absolute calm. She had seen police raids back in her old neighborhood in Chicago, but seeing one here, amid the crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes, was surreal. "I am completely unarmed," Raymond said, his voice terrifyingly steady. He slowly raised his hands, stepping away from the table. "My children are in the room. Please lower your weapons. There is no need for this." "Turn around and place your hands on the back of your head," the lead agent commanded, ignoring Raymond's plea. 2 agents flanked him violently, kicking his legs apart and slamming him face first against the nearest wall. The sound of metal ratcheting shut echoed sickeningly as handcuffs locked around the billionaire's wrists. Agents were already tearing the house apart. Cushions were ripped from sofas, drawers were dumped onto the floor, and files were hastily shoved into plastic bins. They were treating the pristine estate like a crime scene. "Daddy," Leo sobbed, trying to break free from Barbara's grip. "Hold them, Barbara," Raymond said over his shoulder, his voice straining as an agent shoved him toward the door. "Don't let them watch this." Barbara held tight, but she kept her own eyes locked on Raymond. As the agents dragged him past the kitchen island, Raymond deliberately stumbled, throwing his weight toward the marble counter. An agent cursed, pulling him upright, but in that brief second, Raymond locked eyes with Barbara. The billionaire's facade of control vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He didn't speak aloud, but his lips moved carefully, forming 4 distinct words before he was shoved out the door. The Blue Winter Garden. Barbara's breath hitched. She knew exactly what he meant, and the realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. Raymond was hauled out into the blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras that had seemingly materialized out of nowhere. The raid was a spectacle designed to humiliate him publicly, but as the flashing lights faded and the heavy boots of the remaining agents stomped upstairs to tear apart the bedrooms, Barbara tightened her grip on the weeping twins. The real nightmare, she realized, hadn't even begun. Silence in a house that large was usually peaceful. Today it was suffocating. By 4 in the afternoon, the federal agents had finally cleared out, taking boxes of hard drives, financial ledgers, and personal computers. They left behind a house that looked like it had been hit by a localized hurricane. Barbara had spent the afternoon navigating a minefield of trauma. She had answered the aggressive questioning of a junior agent with stoic, polite ignorance. "No, sir, I am just the housekeeper. I wash the clothes and feed the children. I know nothing about Apex Meridian." It was a performance one she executed flawlessly. Her blackness, often ignored or marginalized by Raymond's wealthy peers, became her greatest armor today. To the federal agents, she was invisible, a mere domestic worker, incapable of understanding the complexities of billion-dollar corporate fraud. They didn't even bother to take her phone. Once the front door finally clicked shut, the reality of the situation crashed down. A representative from Child Protective Services had arrived an hour earlier, threatening to take Leo and Harper into state custody since they had no remaining family. But Barbara had calmly walked to Raymond's study, retrieved a specific manila folder from the only drawer the FBI hadn't deemed important, and presented a legally binding temporary guardianship document signed and notarized by Raymond 3 months ago. It was a strange precaution that suddenly made terrifying sense. The CPS worker, frustrated, but legally bound, left with a promise to return the next morning. The twins were now asleep in Barbara's private quarters on the ground floor, exhausted from crying. Barbara sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The massive estate was dark. She stood up, her joints aching from the tension, and walked toward the east wing. The Blue Winter Garden. Raymond's late wife, a brilliant botanist, had built a sprawling indoor conservatory at the back of the house. Most of it was filled with tropical plants and orchids, but there was one specific section, the Blue Winter Garden, dedicated entirely to rare cold-climate flora that bloomed in hues of blue and violet. It was a section of the house the FBI had ignored entirely, assuming it was just a greenhouse filled with dirt and water. Barbara stepped into the humid, glass-domed room. The scent of damp earth and blooming hydrangeas was overwhelming. She walked past the rows of automated sprinklers until she reached the back wall, where a massive antique stone planter held a rare Himalayan blue poppy. Raymond had never allowed anyone to water this specific plant but himself. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She pressed her hands against the side of the heavy stone planter and pushed. It didn't budge. She tried again, leveraging her weight, but it was useless. Frustrated, Barbara crouched down, running her fingers along the ornate carvings of the stone. Her fingers caught on a small, unnatural groove near the base. She pressed it hard. A soft click echoed in the quiet greenhouse. The entire planter, weighing hundreds of pounds, smoothly slid to the right on a hidden motorized track embedded in the floor. Behind it, concealed within the faux brick wall of the conservatory, was a sleek digital safe. Barbara stared at the keypad. She didn't know the code. Raymond hadn't given her a number. Panic began to bubble in her throat. She thought about his life, his wife's birthday, the twins' birthdays. She tried them all. Error. 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 Think, Barbara, she whispered to herself. What connects him to this specific spot? She looked at the blue poppies. Raymond's wife had died on a flight on October 14th. He hated that day. But the day they brought the twins home from the hospital, March 8th. 0308. She punched the numbers in. A green light flashed, and the heavy steel door popped open. Inside the safe wasn't a ledger of stolen money. Barbara reached in and pulled out 3 passports. One was for Raymond under a different name. The other 2 were for Leo and Harper, also under false names. Beside the passports were thick stacks of $100 bills, easily totaling $500,000. But it was the bottom item that made Barbara's blood run cold. It was a thick, leather-bound notebook with a USB drive taped to the cover. Written on the front in Raymond's frantic handwriting were the words, "If I am arrested, they are coming for the kids. Trust no one. Not the police." Pierce did this. Gregory Pierce was Raymond's business partner, the charming, ruthless co-founder of Apex Meridian. Barbara had always hated him. He treated the estate staff like furniture and looked at the twins with a cold, calculating indifference. Barbara opened the notebook. It was a detailed log, not of Raymond's crimes, but of Pierce's. Pierce had been using Apex Meridian's logistics network to launder billions for an international trafficking syndicate. When Raymond found out a month ago, he had quietly started gathering evidence to take to the FBI. But Pierce had beaten him to it. He had planted false financial trails, framed Raymond for a massive embezzlement scheme, and tipped off the federal authorities. The final page of the notebook contained a chilling warning. "Pierce knows I have the evidence. If he gets me locked up, he will take the twins to force me to hand over the drive. He has people inside the agency. The raid is just a distraction." A loud crunch of gravel outside broke Barbara's concentration. She killed the small flashlight she was holding and crept toward the glass walls of the conservatory. Looking out through the heavy foliage, she saw a sleek, unmarked black SUV slowly rolling up the long, winding driveway. Its headlights were off. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the FBI. 2 men in dark clothing stepped out of the vehicle, moving with terrifying, silent precision. One of them pulled a long, suppressed firearm from his jacket. They were heading straight for the side entrance, the door closest to Barbara's quarters, where the twins were sleeping. Barbara didn't panic. The fear that had gripped her all day vanished, replaced by an icy, maternal rage. These men thought they were walking into a house guarded by a helpless maid and 2 sleeping children. They had severely underestimated Barbara Brown. She quickly shoved the passports, the cash, and the notebook into her large canvas tote bag. She closed the safe and hit the button to slide the planter back into place, erasing all evidence of her discovery. There was no time to call 911. Raymond's note made it clear that the local authorities might already be in Pierce's pocket. She was entirely on her own. Barbara slipped out of the winter garden, moving silently through the dark halls of the mansion she knew better than anyone else. She had exactly 2 minutes to wake, the twins get them out through the underground wine cellar tunnels, and disappear into the night before the men breached the house. The billionaire was in handcuffs, the empire was falling, and the wolves were at the door. But as Barbara gripped the heavy iron handle of a fireplace poker, standing between the intruders and the children she loved like her own, she made a silent vow. They were not taking her kids tonight. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, Barbara sprinted down the velvet-lined hallway toward the ground floor staff quarters. The sprawling estate, usually a sanctuary of quiet luxury, now felt like a sprawling death trap. She burst into her bedroom, where the soft, rhythmic breathing of the 6-year-old twins offered a fleeting moment of peace. That peace was an illusion, and time was rapidly running out. "Leo Harper, wake up, babies," Barbara whispered, her voice steady, but laced with an undeniable urgency. She shook their small shoulders gently but firmly. Harper groaned, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Where's Daddy?" "Daddy needs us to play a very quiet game of hide-and-seek right now," Barbara said, pulling them out of their beds and stuffing their feet into their sneakers. She didn't bother with coats or socks. "We have to be quieter than mice. No talking, no crying. Just hold my hands and do exactly as I say." Heavy-booted footsteps crunched against the gravel outside her frosted window. The intruders were circling the perimeter, looking for the easiest point of entry. Barbara threw the canvas tote bag over her shoulder, the heavy leather notebook and the stacks of cash thudding against her hip. She grabbed a solid iron fireplace poker from the hearth in her room, a heavy, brutal instrument of wrought iron, and ushered the children out the door. A deafening crash shattered the silence of the mansion. The glass of the side patio doors had been completely blown out. Barbara pulled the twins into the deep shadows of the servants' corridor. The architecture of the Whitmore estate was incredibly modern in the front, but the bones of the house belonged to a 1920s manor. Barbara knew every inch of its history, including the architectural quirks the original builders had left behind. "Check the upstairs bedrooms," a gruff, muffled voice commanded from the kitchen. "Pierce wants the kids. Don't leave without them." Harper whimpered softly, terrified by the loud voices. Barbara knelt down, pressing a finger to her own lips, her eyes wide and fierce. She tapped Harper's nose, forcing a reassuring smile, then stood and guided them toward the walk-in pantry. At the back of the pantry, hidden behind towering shelves of imported pasta and canned truffles, was an antique, heavy-duty dumbwaiter that connected the kitchen to the underground wine cellar. Raymond had kept it functional simply as a conversation piece, but Barbara had meticulously maintained its pulleys because it saved her from carrying heavy crates of wine up the stairs. "Get in," she breathed, opening the wooden hatch. The wooden box was barely large enough for the two children. "It's dark," Leo whispered, his lower lip trembling. "I'll be right beside you the whole time," Barbara promised, kissing his forehead, before lifting him inside, followed by his sister. "Close your eyes and count to 60. She shut the hatch just as the heavy footsteps entered the main dining room, mere feet away from the pantry door. Gripping the thick rope, Barbara began to lower the dumbwaiter hand, overhand, ignoring the excruciating burn of the coarse hemp tearing at her palms. She lowered it as silently as humanly possible, her muscles screaming under the strain. Once the rope went slack, signaling they had reached the bottom, Barbara slipped out of the pantry. She couldn't take the stairs. The intruders were systematically sweeping the ground floor. Instead, she moved like a ghost through the service hallways, utilizing the narrow, unlit passages designed a century ago to keep the domestic staff out of sight of the wealthy owners. She descended the spiraling stone stairs to the cellar, the air growing damp and cold. Row upon row of vintage Bordeaux and Pinot Noir lined the mahogany racks, casting long, eerie shadows under the dim emergency lighting. Barbara hurried to the dumbwaiter shaft and opened the bottom hatch. The twins were huddled together, terrified, but silent. She pulled them out, her heart breaking at the sight of their tear-stained cheeks. "You are doing so beautifully," she whispered, ushering them toward the back of the cellar. During the Prohibition era, the original owner had excavated a tunnel behind the north wall that led directly to a hidden exit inside the estate's massive stone carriage house. Raymond had converted the carriage house into a garage for his classic car collection. Just as Barbara reached for the heavy iron latch of the tunnel door, the stairwell door at the top of the cellar groaned open. A bright beam from a tactical flashlight pierced the gloom, sweeping across the dusty bottles. "I'm checking the basement," a voice echoed down the stone steps. Barbara froze. She shoved the twins behind a massive oak wine barrel and pressed her back against the cold stone wall, clutching the iron poker in her right hand. Her breath caught in her throat. She could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. The intruder moved methodically, sweeping the flashlight down every aisle. He was a massive man wearing a black tactical vest and a ski mask. He reached the aisle where Barbara was hiding. The beam of light illuminated the edge of Harper's pink sneaker, protruding slightly from behind the barrel. The man paused, a cruel smirk, visible beneath the eye holes of his mask. He raised his suppressed pistol and stepped forward. He never saw Barbara move. Stepping out from the shadows with the explosive force of a coiled spring, Barbara swung the heavy iron fireplace poker with every ounce of strength she possessed. The thick metal connected with the side of the intruder's knee with a sickening, wet crunch. The man let out a muffled howl of agony, his leg buckling instantly. As he collapsed forward, dropping his weapon, Barbara didn't hesitate. She brought the heavy iron handle down across the back of his neck. The man hit the stone floor and went completely limp. Gasping for air, her hands shaking violently, Barbara kicked the pistol out of reach. She grabbed the twins by their hands, practically dragging them through the heavy wooden door into the pitch-black tunnel. They ran blindly through the damp, narrow passage, the smell of mildew and wet earth filling their lungs. When they finally burst through the hidden doorway into the carriage house, Barbara didn't bother with the sleek Ferraris or the vintage Porsches. She went straight to the dusty corner where the groundskeeper kept his old beat-up Ford pickup truck. The keys were always left in the sun visor. She threw the kids into the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and slammed her foot on the gas. The truck roared to life, smashing straight through the wooden doors of the carriage house and tearing across the manicured lawns, leaving deep trenches in the immaculate grass. By the time the remaining intruders rushed outside, the old Ford was already disappearing down the winding, tree-lined highway, swallowed entirely by the dark Connecticut night. Morning broke over a dingy, cash-only motel on the outskirts of New Haven, a stark contrast to the marble and glass of the Whitmore estate. Barbara sat at a chipped veneer table, staring at the screen of a cheap laptop she had purchased from a 24-hour electronics store an hour prior. The twins were sound asleep on the lumpy mattress, exhausted from the terror of the night. Barbara plugged in the USB drive. Raymond's notebook had been meticulous, but the digital evidence was damning. Gregory Pierce hadn't just embezzled funds. He had actively utilized Apex Meridian's automated logistics software to route shipping containers filled with illicit weapons and narcotics through international ports, bypassing customs via a back door in the AI code. Furthermore, there were recorded phone calls of Pierce negotiating with federal agents, paying massive bribes to orchestrate the raid on Raymond's home to seize control of the company. Pierce was a monster, and right now the world thought he was the victim of Raymond's greed. Barbara opened her tote bag and stared at the $500,000 in cash. She could take the passports, grab the twins, and disappear to Europe. Raymond had given her the means to escape. But looking at the sleeping faces of Leo and Harper, she knew she couldn't let their father rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. She wasn't going to run. She was going to burn Gregory Pierce to the ground. She needed a weapon, and she knew exactly where to buy one. Not a gun, but something far more lethal in the corporate world. Using Raymond's notebook, she found the name of a man Raymond had considered hiring before his arrest, Arthur Kensington, a notoriously ruthless, high-powered corporate litigator based in Manhattan who despised Gregory Pearce. By noon, Barbara walked into the towering glass lobby of Kensington and Associates on Wall Street. She looked entirely out of place in her wrinkled civilian clothes, carrying a canvas tote bag. The receptionist tried to dismiss her, but Barbara simply unzipped the bag, pulled out $50,000 in banded cash, and dropped it on the pristine glass desk. "Tell Mr. Kensington that the legal guardian of the Whitmore estate's majority shares is here to retain his services," Barbara said, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "And tell him I have the proof to put Gregory Pearce in federal prison." 3 hours later, the plan was set in motion. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency meeting of the Apex Meridian Board of Directors was convened in a penthouse boardroom overlooking Central Park. Gregory Pearce stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, wearing a bespoke suit and a triumphant smile. "Gentlemen, ladies, it is a dark day for our company," Pearce announced, feigning a solemn tone. "Raymond Whitmore's betrayal has cost us billions in market capitalization. However, under my new leadership as interim CEO, we will rebuild the trust of the public and our shareholders." "You're not rebuilding anything, Gregory," a sharp, commanding voice rang out. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Barbara Brown strode into the boardroom, her posture perfectly straight, radiating an aura of untouchable confidence. Flanking her was Arthur Kensington, holding a thick stack of manila folders, followed by 3 high-profile investigative journalists from major news networks. The board members gasped. Pearce's smug smile vanished, replaced by a deep, dark scowl. "What is the meaning of this security? Get this woman out of here. She's Whitmore's maid, for God's sake. I am the officially appointed legal guardian of Leo and Harper Whitmore." Barbara stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She walked directly toward the head of the table, not breaking eye contact with Pearce. "As of 3 months ago, Raymond Whitmore legally transferred his controlling shares into a blind trust for his children, naming me as the sole proxy voting member in the event of his incapacitation or arrest." Pearce's face drained of color. "That's impossible." "It's fully verified, filed, and ironclad, Mr. Pearce," Arthur Kensington said, dropping the folders onto the table. "Ms. Brown currently controls 51% of Apex Meridian, and her first act, as majority proxy, is to terminate your employment effective immediately." "You can't do this!" Pearce shouted, panic finally piercing his polished exterior. He looked at the security guard standing by the door. "Throw them out. She's an accomplice to a criminal." Barbara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver USB drive. She tossed it onto the table. It clattered to a halt directly in front of the chairman of the board. "That drive contains undeniable proof of Gregory Pearce's international money laundering weapons trafficking and the bribery of federal officials to frame Raymond Whitmore." Barbara announced, her eyes sweeping across the horrified faces of the board members. "Copies have already been sent to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the esteemed journalists standing behind me." Kensington smiled thinly. "I believe the FBI is currently waiting in the lobby, Mr. Pearce. It seems the agents you didn't bribe are quite eager to speak with you." Pearce lunged across the table. His composure entirely shattered his hands, reaching for Barbara's throat. But he never made it. His own private security guards, realizing they were standing in a room full of journalists while a federal crime was being exposed, tackled their boss to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. Barbara looked down at the pathetic, writhing billionaire pinned against the expensive carpet. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply adjusted the strap of her tote bag. "You thought because I washed your coffee cups and scrubbed your floors I was invisible," Barbara said, quietly, though her words carried across the silent room. You made a very grave mistake. Never threaten my children. By sunset, the news cycle had completely flipped. Footage of Gregory Pearce being dragged out of his own corporate headquarters in handcuffs dominated every major network. The digital evidence was insurmountable. Within 24 hours, the charges against Raymond Whitmore were officially dropped, and he was released from federal custody. When Raymond finally returned to the Connecticut estate, he bypassed the waiting press and ran straight through the front doors. Barbara was waiting in the foyer, holding Leo and Harper. Raymond fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around his children, sobbing uncontrollably into their hair. After a long moment, he looked up at Barbara. The brilliant, powerful tech mogul looked at the woman who had saved his family, his company, and his life, and he realized she was never just the housekeeper. "How can I ever repay you?" Raymond whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Barbara smiled warmly, her sharp eyes softening as she reached out and gently patted the billionaire's shoulder. "You can start by giving me a raise, Mr. Whitmore," she said smoothly. "And you're going to help me clean up the wine cellar. There's a terrible mess down there." Did Barbara's incredible bravery and quick thinking leave you speechless? This true-to-life saga proves that the most powerful heroes often work in the shadows, armed with nothing but fierce love and unwavering courage. If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of loyalty and justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping stories. Don't miss our next upload.